Pretending to die. People were screaming and crying in the jungle compound. The tiny commune had become emotionally charged. Parents were in a tug-of-war with their children, one parent wanting to go and the other wanting to stay. So many had decided to escape the People's Temple that we had to order another plane. We left for the airstrip. Dressed in an oversized yellow poncho, Larry Layton was eager to board the cargo plane. I distrusted him and asked that he be searched before boarding. A journalist patted him down, but did not find the gun. Larry Layton had hidden under his poncho. Thinking back, I now realize we were helpless. Here we were, a congressman, congressional aides, journalists, cameramen. Not one among us, a police officer or military escort. We had nothing to protect us other than the imagined shield of infallibility of a U.S. congressman and members of the U.S. press corps. Suddenly we heard a scream. Seconds later, I heard an unfamiliar noise. I saw people running into the bushes and realized that the noise was gunshot. I dropped to the ground and curled up around the wheel of the plane, pretending to be dead. I heard footsteps. I felt my body twitch as someone pumped bullets into me at point-blank range. I was shot 5 times. The gunmen continued to walk around the tarmac, shooting innocent people. Soon, it was quiet. I opened my eyes and looked down at my body. It was ravaged. A bone was sticking out of my arm, and blood was everywhere. I remember thinking, my God, I am 28 years old, and I'm about to die. I yelled out for Congressman Ryan, calling his name several times. There was no answer. The plane's engine was still revving, and I thought that if I could just get to that cargo hatch, I could escape this place. I crawled towards the opening, dragging my body as close as I could to the baggage compartment. A reporter from the Washington Post picked me up and put me in the cargo hold. I remember saying to him, "Could you give me something to stop my bleeding?" He gave me his shirt. I was losing so much blood that the shirt was soaked in seconds. The plane was filled with bullet holes, and we soon realized that this would not be our flight out of this hell on earth. Someone pulled me out of the plane and placed me back on the airstrip. Accidentally, they had laid me on an anthill, and ants started crawling all over me. Lying next to me was a reporter's tape recorder. I taped a last message to my parents and brother. I told them that I loved them. Supposedly, the Guyanese army was going to secure the airstrip and rescue us, so I held on tightly to the belief that the army would come. It grew dark and I continued to wait. Although I was in excruciating pain, I clung to life. In the middle of the night, word had gotten back to us that there had been a mass suicide at the People's Temple. At 1 o'clock the next day, 20 hours after the shooting, the Guyanese Air Force arrived. Their arrival coincided with a message to the world that more than 900 people, including a U.S. congressman and members of his delegation, were dead. The headlines called it the worst mass suicide in history. To this day, I still refer to the events at Jonestown as a mass murder. The Guyanese Air Force transported the survivors to a waiting U.S. Air Force medevac plane in Georgetown. Etched in my memory is how I felt that very moment. As though someone had wrapped me in the American flag. I was so grateful. Loaded with survivors, the Air Force plane set off for the United States. As we taxied down the runway, I recall glancing down at my body. It seemed so surreal, as though the mangled lump of flesh belonged to someone other than me. Months later, I was told that the medical technician who attended to me during that flight had said that I was 3 minutes from death. We finally arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, where I was immediately taken into surgery. I had developed gas gangrene and the surgeons debated whether to amputate my leg. After 4 hours of surgery, the nurse wheeled me out of the surgical ward, and there stood my mother, who had traveled from San Francisco to meet me. They told my mother that they needed to transfer me to Baltimore Shock Trauma Center to attempt to stem the spread of gangrene. I begged my mother and the doctors to please take me by ambulance, fearing I would die in another plane flight. The shock trauma center was lit with incredible bright lights. Numerous IVs were hooked up to me. I remember asking the nurse, how many calories are in all that stuff flowing into my body? 3,000, she replied. I said, oh my God, I'm going to get fat. Interesting, isn't it, how we can lose perspective in the middle of trauma. I said, oh my God. After yet another surgery, I was returned to my hospital room. The surgeons had repaired my body, but my hair was still matted with the blood from Guyanese dirt and dead ants. In an act of love, I would never forget, my brother tenderly washed my hair. The doctors remained very concerned about the gangrene in my wounds. In a last-ditch effort, they began a series of hyperbaric treatments that required me to be placed in a chamber filled with antibacterial microbes and oxygen. The chamber resembled an iron lung. Each time they removed me from the chamber, I vomited violently. Unfortunately, they had to repeat this process several times over the next few days. Confident they had gotten rid of the gangrene, they transferred me back to Arlington Hospital. I was also placed under 24-hour protection with U.S. Marshals posted outside my door because threats had been made against my life. Some individuals associated with the People's Temple blamed our congressional investigation for the mass deaths in Guyana and wanted to retaliate. The surgeons performed skin grafts on my legs, the gunshots had blown apart my right arm, and a steel dowel had been inserted to hold together what remained. The radial nerve in my arm was damaged, and I could not use my fingers or lift my arm. The first time they tried to get me on my feet to walk, I fainted. Hospitalized for nearly 2 months and having endured 10 surgeries, I was finally discharged and was able to fly back to San Francisco. The days ahead were a flurry of interviews about Jonestown. I was not allowed to stay in my house because of the death threats, so I lived with a friend. I still carried 2 bullets in my body, which the doctors had deemed too risky to remove. I never appeared in public without layers of clothes to cover what I had begun to believe was my hideous, disfigured body. In the following years, I would endure months of physical therapy to regain the use of my arm. I was 28, a single woman who could hardly feed herself and whose body was maimed and scarred. One day I realized that if I was going to get over this, if I ever was going to go forward, I had to figure out a way not to wallow in self-pity. The exact moment I came to terms with what had happened in Guyana occurred years later on a crowded beach in Hawaii. The disfigured body I walked in was mine. The joy I felt at just being alive had become greater than my insecurities. I had come to realize that a person's body was irrelevant in the big picture of life. Physical beauty, a shallow concern. I was disabled, but I did not believe that the disability of any kind prevented me from living a full and wonderful life. If anything, my disfigurement had opened my eyes to the bias often harbored towards those who are different. I put on a bathing suit and that day walked across the Hawaiian beach as people stared at the remnant scars of my gunshot wounds. I kept walking, and I learned with every step that as difficult as it was, one must take the next step.